The last key data property we'll talk about is faithfulness. And faithfulness is how well does the data capture reality? It's really asking the question, do I trust this data? So, does my data contain unrealistic or incorrect values? So, as an example, are there dates in the future for events in the past? Or locations that don't exist? Or negative counts? Or misspellings of names? Or large outliers? Does my data violate obvious dependencies? So for example, if I have an age field and a birthday field and they don't match, well, one has to be wrong. Either the age or the birthday data has to be incorrect. A very, very important question to ask is, was the data entered by hand? Right? If it's entered by hand, there might be spelling errors, there might be fields that are shifted, and so on. Did the form require the fields to be input, or does it provide defaults? And the person can just hit enter to skip through the defaults, right? Are there obvious signs of data falsification? So for example, repeated names, or fake looking email addresses, or repeated uses of uncommon names or fields. Let me give you a little example. So right now, there are lots of COVID-19 clinical trials going on at hundreds of sites across the world. And at each one of those clinical trial sites, when patients show up, there's an intake process, and their height, weight, temperature, and blood pressure are recorded. And each time they return to the site, those metrics are collected. Now, collecting blood pressure, it takes time, and it can be hard to do sometimes depending on the person. And so oftentimes, you'll see the same blood pressure recorded across multiple visits. Now, how likely is it that it'll be identical for a person on multiple visits? It's not very likely. And so that's a clear sign of data falsification, and it's done simply because people are trying to save time. So that's an example of a sign that your data might not be faithful. Other signs are missing values or default values. And so you have to ask the question, well, what does a missing value look like? Or what does a default value look like? Well, maybe it's just a blank field, or it's a zero, or it's an odd number like -1 or 999 or 12345, or not a number, or null, or 1970 or 1900, and so on. So now the question is, what do I do when I have a missing value? Well, one alternative is to just drop records that have missing values. And this is probably the most common approach that people use. But you have to be careful, because when you drop values, you might introduce some biases in the remaining values. And so it's important to understand whether those missing or corrupted records might be related to something of interest. Simply because the blood pressure values are the same between two visits doesn't necessarily mean that all the other data is corrupted or falsified. It begs the question we need to investigate to understand, but we don't necessarily want to simply throw out the entire record simply because one field is corrupted. Another alternative is imputation, and this is where you infer the missing values. So again, let's use an example. We'll use one from the class. Let's say your dog chews through your power cord of your laptop, so you can't do one of the homeworks. So what do? Well, we could just simply drop that record since there's no value for the homework. Or alternatively, we could try to infer what grade you would have received had you done that homework. So one approach is what's called mean imputation, where we replace your grade for that missing homework with an average value. Now, it's very important that we look at which mean we're going to use, right? We don't want to take your mean of your midterm and final grades, or your mean of your project grades. We want to use the closest related subgroup's mean. So in this case, this would be your other homework assignments. So we take the mean of all your homework assignments that you did submit, and we use that to replace the one that you didn't take. But there's another approach, and that's what's called hot deck imputation, where we just simply replace it with a random value, where that random value is chosen from that closest subgroup, and we use that for the missing value. So that would say, of all your other homeworks, we pick one at random, and that replaces the grade of the homework that you didn't turn in. Now, Professor Gonzalez, who is one of the co-creators of this class, he has some suggestions. You can either drop the missing values, but make sure you check for any introduced bias. Use your domain knowledge for this to make sure that you haven't introduced any bias by dropping that value. Or, and this is a little bit more complicated, you can directly model the missing values in your future analyses. So what you're going to do is you're going to build analysis methods that recognize that there may be missing values and have models for those missing values and can basically do the analysis with those gaps. It's a lot more complicated, a lot more work, but it'll give you a much more accurate and representative result. So, some signs that your data might be not faithful are missing values or default values, truncated data. So early versions of Excel, they had a limit of 65,536 rows and 255 columns. Exceed that, data just silently gets dropped. Right? So the solution is to be very aware of those consequences and how that truncation might affect your sample. Another sign would be time zone inconsistencies. And here there are two solutions. One is convert everything to a common time zone. So convert everything, say, to UTC. The second solution is convert to the time zone of the location that you're interested in understanding. And this is important if you're trying to model behavior. Right? If you're trying to look at what do people do at lunchtime, well, converting everything to UTC isn't really going to be helpful because noon is going to be some different time. Duplicated records or fields are another sign that something might be wrong with your data. And so the solution is to identify and eliminate those records and use maybe the primary key to do that. But you have to be very careful that that elimination doesn't induce biases. And so look at the implication it has on the sample. Another example would be spelling errors. And so here the solution might be apply corrections or drop records for things that are not in your dictionary. Again, be careful about biases that might be induced and the implications on your sample. Units that are not specified or consistent. So one solution is infer the units and then check that the values are within a reasonable range. So I have temperatures, indoor temperatures. If the values are in the 20s, chances are those are Celsius, unless it's a walk-in freezer, in which case those might be Fahrenheit. But most likely those are going to be Celsius. And there are many other examples that you want to look at in your data when you're doing your exploratory data analysis to make sure that your data is faithful.